In essence and in culmination, theatre has always been a result of hybridization. If we take into account the various disciplines a conventional production would require, the bringing together of voice and movement training, perhaps a live orchestra, and within that orchestra, there is the harmony of different skills, composition, conduction, each individual instrument coming together to make the final symphony. And so on and so forth go the nuances of performance. Performance art, like all art then, is no longer an isolated process. It always draws on knowledge already made available to us through historical record keeping and history keeping through stories. Here's an example, one which relates to the form and aesthetics we will be talking about as we go forward. At first glance, these two paintings can deceive you through the simplicity with which they relate to each other. The first is an opaque watercolor and gold on cloth late medieval era Mughal painting from India titled Argan Dev Brings the Chest of Armor to Hamza. It is from a series of paintings based on the epic Hamza Nama, the oldest saga in the region's tradition of oral storytelling known as Dastan Goi. The official website of the Brooklyn Museum, where the painting currently resides, describes it thus. The Hamzanama recounts the picturesque exploits of Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The Mughal Emperor Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, ordered his artists to prepare an illustrated copy of the Hamzanama on a scale never seen before. 1,400 paintings on sheets of paper backed with cloth. Literary sources record that though more than 50 painters busied themselves with the colossal undertaking, it took 15 years to complete. 4 of the folios are held by the Brooklyn Museum. This painting depicts the demon Argan bringing a casket of arms to Hamza. Emerging from the water, here rendered by frothy, curling waves, he presents a seemingly ferocious aspect with his spotted skin, flaming eyes, and sharp fangs projecting from a mouth with a rather frozen grimace. On the shore is Hamza, seated on a throne beneath a bright canopy held up by 2 poles and ropes. His sovereign status is indicated by a row of attendants on his left, carrying such insignia as the yak-tail whisk that is waved over Hamza's head. The second painting was made by a Lahore-born, Staten Island-based artist by the name of Farrar. No, it's not me, even though she does share my name and my artistic interests. Now this, as I am sure you can tell, is a reworking of the original medieval painting. Instead of the chest of armor like in the original, this reworking shows Argandev bringing a case of Corona beer to the protagonist and the other host of characters in the epic. Almost exclusively, all of Rizvi's work deals with reworking classical paintings with one element of contemporary pop culture. As I said, at first you might be motivated to laugh at the simple cheekiness of this endeavor and then move on. That would be an error on your part. To not sit and ponder just what it is that Rizvi is really doing by hybridizing these elements of classical South Asian culture and modern global pop culture. In her paper, Politics and Poetics of Translation of the Classics, Shaheen Sabah writes, translation is not a mechanical transposition of words across languages, but a cognitive activity that demands active participation of the translator, as the individual identity of the translator is not isolated from the process. Could it be that Rizvi is moving beyond tropes of translation that strive for easily digestible art with non-native audiences and is actually producing artwork that asks the audience to engage in a cross-cultural, even intercultural reception of aesthetics? It wouldn't be so radical an idea from my own point of view and the point of view of many other non-Westerners. We who, as a result of globalization, have grown up and therefore been cultured in a hybridized world. Sabha goes on to explore how intranslatability is a major challenge for translators of South Asian epics and other non Western canons. This I had to assume while conducting my own creative research into a storytelling format heavily dependent on decadence as a form, uncompromisingly so in the text, was because of the decadence's homogeneity in aesthetic effect. From the chapter on globalization in my economics class during 12th standard, I remember an example of globalized culture being the Indo Western dressing that many Indians have adopted into their daily wear. I myself often pair my Indian kurtis with Western denim jeans. And of course, globalization is an exchange, the balance and equity of which, or lack thereof, I shall also discuss ahead. Which means that this very kurti has been adopted into Western fashion trends as tunics, which technically they might be, but culturally there is a nuance to that terminology. Going back to Shaheen Sabah's argument that any work produced by an artist working in the space between established cultural dichotomies is a testament to their identity, I would like to bring up another point she writes in her paper. If translation or transcendence means to carry over, it is not just a linguistic and verbal carryover, although that is what flashes in one's mind when one thinks about translation. Quite the contrary, translation is a loaded baggage, since a text is transported from one world to another. Words are highly symbolic, with social, economic, historical, aesthetical, political, cultural, mythical, and legendary valences. This transcendence of worlds has always been of interest to me personally. I am interested in how humans perform this transcendence, how we communicate with each other, what we are limited by, and what helps to break those limitations. Of course, I am not the first person to be interested in transcendental performance art. On Arthur's influence on future generations of universalists in theatre, Rick Knowles writes in Theatre and Interculturalism, like Brecht, Arthur was a staunch opponent of the bourgeois theatre, but he was no materialist. Arthur's Oriental theatre never existed. Nevertheless, his writings made it real for a charismatic European male lineage that includes Jerzy Grotowski, Eugenio Barba, Peter Brook, and others who focus most intensely on the art of the actor and who can be loosely grouped as the universalists. My questions in this duration of practices research, which was afforded to me at Middlesex University through its MA Theatre Arts program, revolved around narrative aesthetic effect from age old storytelling performance practices from South Asia, the themes of which I tried to approach from a sociological lens, which required delving also into the politics of experiencing womanhood in metropolitan contemporaneous settings. I attempted to adapt and translate those modern experiences through an established performance form, Dastangoi. Questions about migration, the politics of translation and transmission of aesthetics, and diasporic identity can be answered through performance work and reflection on the process. The research aspect involved conducting interviews and having conversations about varied experiences of the same phenomena, centering on the experiences of women who have migrated out of their hometowns to London, paralleled with other metropolitan migrations. The performance methodologies drew on Sufi storytelling traditions that transgress not just the boundaries of time and region, but also conventions and norms in South Asia. In its serialized iterations, the project is about the time and place it occurs within, but floats on that surface while being keenly aware of the undercurrents of identities, histories, and affinities in everything that came to be this exact point in our contemporary society. It employs multimodal performance, including footage both directed and documentary, Dastan Goi, epic and storytelling elements, and Indian classical aesthetics. My questions have evolved out of the attempts at translating aesthetics and into transmitting aesthetics. This happened because during trials and scratch runs, I noticed that there is a chance for me to induce conditions which allow for novel aesthetic effects on non native audiences of South Asian aesthetics. In Theatre Own and Foreign, from the book The Dramatic Touch of Difference, Erika Fischer-Lichte poses the following questions. Does interculturalism have a completely specific function in each culture to fulfill, or can one locate general aims and goals which serve as worldwide phenomena? Does interculturalism in theatre indicate national, continental, or world culture? Does it guarantee and confirm cultural identity, or does it metamorphose or even solve identity? Is it a question of the attempt to propagate an awareness of a foreign culture, or is it rather a cultural exploitation? Does theatrical interculturalism today support and provoke intercultural understanding? Or does it deny fundamental differences between cultures and make any communication impossible if one is deceived into believing in a shared community which actually does not exist? My aim in experimenting with these ideas then became not to adapt South Asian aesthetics as palatable for Western audiences. Rather, I employ the far reaching potential for a non discriminatory, in terms of audience and subject, form of performance latent within the traditions, which inherently evolved out of migratory histories and absorbent character and reflective capacities. As our world becomes more amalgamated as a result of post 20th century global traffic, diasporic existence, and previously exclusive contemporary cultures, it is important to develop and identify artistic practices that aim to be about and for these globalized audiences. The world and society at large are not simply multicultural anymore. These cultures have become interlaced to such an extent that cultural symbols from the West are now part of the cultural conscience in non Western regions as rigidly as any other indigenous signifier. In this endeavor, I aim to devise practices that draw on established methodologies in Sufi storytelling, analysis and implementation of the Indian Bohemian to intercultural art, and the implications of translating stories, transmitting experiences, and transporting audiences. My multidisciplinary methods come from past and contemporary practitioners and theorists in both South Asia and the rest of the world, as the aim is to create performance art meant for and about audiences large not just in quantity but also in constitution. India itself has a culture of much hybridized and fusion heavy aesthetics. The tradition of Dastan Goi was thus influenced uniquely throughout the centuries, shedding certain conventions entirely over time. And while Dastan Goi has been going through a revival in India and Pakistan through the work of artists and researchers such as Fauzia Dastan Go, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, and Fawad Khan, there is immense potential latent within the form itself, as evidenced by Anjali Gera Roy's chapter Qissa and popular Hindi cinema. In my practice, I explored the documentary film format interweaved with performance and performative storytelling to begin an exploration of what I have termed Neo Dastangoi. By the way, all the literature, media, research, and art I am referring to in this video will be listed together at the end and also in the description section down below, along with further reading and viewing materials that influenced, informed, and instigated my research and practice in any way. As my professor Joe has emphasized time and time again, we must pay attention to how method becomes form. To explain the relevance of methodology, Neodastangoi in this case, to the themes I attempted to explore: space and identity occupation, by women. Why did I choose this form to communicate these stories? Like the traditional universalists, I do believe that there is a commonality of experiences that can be traced throughout humanity, but I also believe in the power of context in art. The research in Practice as Research meant that first I had to decode, deconstruct, and lay out the engineering of the piece I wanted to create. The Cinema Cartography YouTube channel's video essay, The Metaphysical Mirror Art in Context, which will be linked below, is a highly recommended watch from me. The basic idea is that in interpreting art, to understand what does it mean, we must do away with the what, and instead adopt the curiosity-filled approach of how does it mean. Curiosity was, in fact, one of the unofficial official tenets in the pursuit of this degree that was imbibed in us from the very beginning and dutifully reiterated over the entire year by the teaching staff. Something for which I am eternally grateful, because from my previous experiences with education and teachers, it felt like a refreshing validation of a relatively untapped natural inclination of mine. The how of art looks at the contexts, social, economic, and spiritual, when trying to decode art, while recognizing that as open to interpretation as art inherently is, certain supporting structures for meaning making are based on these contexts. During this year, I understood the value of developing performance in an academic environment, a unique opportunity to trial and create a piece through multiple practical iterations, while also ensuring that there is always a peer group and expert opinion on hand. During these sessions, I excavated a structure and aesthetic best suited for the London iteration of this piece, and this allowed it to become a coherent and unique piece that stands on its own. Throughout the various meetings of the sometimes continuing, sometimes newer participants, there was an intense focus on the audiovisual documentation of these sessions, which would later become part of the final piece as aesthetic and narrative textual elements in themselves. This was a process that we had trialed before during our connecting practices and collaborative projects. Coming back to the questions of intercultural theatre practices that depend on transcendent human experiences, we have to look at the existent practices in the dominant academic culture of the West. In his book, Theatre and Interculturalism, Rick Knowles writes, reflecting on Fischer-Lichte's essay Interculturalism and Contemporary Theatre, interculturalism became a conscious program only with Goethe's work at the Weimar Theatre in Germany between 1791 and 1817, where he nevertheless produced only plays from the European canon, and in his own masterpiece, Faust, which was deeply influenced by Sanskrit drama. At Weimar, Goethe began a long tradition in the West of using intercultural links to access truths that were supposed to be universal. But most of the modernist theatre that resulted involved the incorporation of elements of the performance forms or techniques of non-European cultures in ways that removed them from their social contexts, histories, and belief systems, othering them, treating them as exotica, or reducing them to their purely formal or aesthetic properties. It was this cannibalization of form, without respect for the cultures that produced them, that early interculturalism most directly participated in the West's colonization of the world's cultures and peoples. Knowles goes on to talk about the intercultural practices of giants in the field, like Bertolt Brecht and his materialist approach, and Antoine Artaud's universalist approach. Of these discoveries, the most influential in terms of the theory and practice of interculturalism in the 20th century and beyond have been Antoine Artaud's encounter with Balinese dance at the Paris Colonial Exposition in 1931 and Bertolt Brecht's discovery of Chinese acting in a performance in Moscow in 1935 by leading actor Mei Lanfang. Arthur's discovery led directly to the formulation of his theatre of cruelty. In his essay on the Balinese theatre, first published in 1931, Brecht's to his first use of the term Verfremdungseffekt, defamiliarization effect, in his 1936 essay Alienation Effects in Chinese Acting, upon which much of his subsequent work was built. Unlike Artaud, however, Brecht was committed not to avant-garde art or to individual psychology, but to the political potential of theatre to change the world. And unlike Artaud's, his influence has not been limited to the West. Brecht's own theatrical work, inspired by his appropriation of Chinese acting, has been reappropriated in such places as Japan, Africa, India, and China itself, as is demonstrated consistently throughout Fischer-Lichte's The Dramatic Touch of Difference. There, Iwabuchi Tatsuji writes about the complexities of Brecht's divided reception in Japan. Vasudha Dalmia Ludritz, in an essay titled To Be More Brechtian is to Be More Indian, deals in detail with the use of Brecht by the great Hindi playwright Habib Tanveer. And Olarotimi, in an essay entitled Much Ado About Brecht, compares epic theatre with traditional African practice. Rotimi wryly points out that Brecht extracted some raw materials from the matrix of third world theatre, only to have them now packaged and labeled and exported anew into the third world. Noting Brecht's borrowings from Chinese theatre, Ding Yangzhong sees this intercultural reappropriation as reaping the interest on our lawn. These histories beg the contemporary question of what would happen if creators from the global south are given the stage, the studios, and the general resources to explore the communicative potential of their native techniques and aesthetics at the 21st century transnational level, with the intercultural hybridity emanating from the source of the practice and the form. Considering what Shaheen Sabah says of the role of identity in art making, the seemingly simplistic nature of Farrar Rizvi's reworked Mughal art is elevated to a more subtle and relevant dynamism worthy of notice. Instead of the appropriative Orientalist fetishism or abhorrence prevalent in representations of non-Western cultures, we now have the option to perceive a culturally balanced artwork, one that does not reduce, fetishize, or compromise on any aspect of a global experience, something we know Rizvi is adept to talk about. While the conventional form of Dastangoi relies heavily on the use of lyrical Urdu prose writing and a required structure to verifiably make it a dastan, an epic, or a saga, I relied on elements from the aesthetics of this storytelling tradition. This meant I delivered the performance in English script, adapted to the rhythms and imagery of Urdu storytelling, instead of simply translating Urdu, Hindi, or Punjabi texts. With the themes, what I was specifically trying to explore was patterns of commonality in experiences that can seem very different because of the people having them, the places they occur in, and the varying histories and potentials they represent. All of this is to say, the context for the piece was women and how they occupy space. The attempt was to include different contexts, perspectives, and so different women. I juxtaposed the different contexts of their stories with the common context of migration and what I termed the room and the world. To highlight these ideas, to add these contours of variety, I included film in the performance. The temporality of recorded footage and sound was to add to the ephemeral quality of the themes. Within the grounding of a live performance, we were also tangling with moving images that were pre-recorded. To an extent, I feel the aims were met, but there were also certain things that I would love to do differently in future iterations. To list a few, The projection format was chosen for its convenience in moving the projector and thus the projection itself across the room. The movement is a symbolic gesture, sure, but could it be done differently? What difference would pre installed film make? And if continuing with moving film, can the movement be made more choreographed? This leads me to evaluate the performance itself. As the performer, I felt there was a stark difference between day one of the performance and day two. The recording available on my channel is from day one. I think I was definitely more comfortable during the second day because I felt like I knew what I was doing, yes, but even more what I could do, especially in case anything went off course. I know being nervous is part of performing, but I think in this case I was nervous to my own detriment, especially during the first 15 minutes, where the most movement and setting up is. It is evident that I am concerned about the reveals and the setting of the space before and as I am doing it. However, once those things are out of the way, I relax back into character fully, as I felt. And from there, the tone and immersion of the performance truly emerge. Talking about revealing space, I incorporated this element throughout the piece. Some of these, like the dressing table and the two screens, were a part of the initial plan I had in mind. However, the most prominent one is, of course, the beginning, which came about after a little confusion around studio spaces arose during the devising and finalizing weeks. As often happens with art, incorporating any surprises as the plan is a fantastic experiment, if not a final choice. In my case, it was luckily both. I do think that inviting the audience into a big dark room and transforming it into a comfortable, pleasing space where they might want to recline and enjoy listening to stories really adds to the piece in an indispensable way. For this reason, I do not wish to compromise on it in future iterations. I am excited by the idea that I would have to adapt it according to the venue, which in turn could lead to other similar discoveries. And I definitely want to have more rehearsal hours under my belt before I perform again. And about the sound, I feel I would love to try it out with cleaner audio for sure, but there was something that was definitely added, I felt, because of the noise, and but I would like to incorporate it in a much more, again, choreographed and planned manner. Coming back to the women's stories, I was talking about patterns. Looking for these, I had decided early on that distinguishing between the metaphors of the room and the world would be done directly through dreams, as they represent the sub and unconscious. But I was never willing to neglect the sociological implications of women's space occupation out in the material world. Satyajit Ray's film Ghari Beri, The Home and the World, added to this conversation that had already begun in my head. Even for the title, I was surprised to learn the name of his film because it was so similar to my own. I felt quite validated. The film, based on Rabindranath Tagore's novel of the same name, amongst other themes, explores the protagonist Bimla's journey from inside of her husband's estate to the outside. She never really steps outside the home, but spoiler warning, through her object of affection, her husband's friend, who is a radical politician, experiences the outside world and its concerns on a level she had not before bothered to engage with. The sequence of her actually crossing the corridor that women of the house do not go beyond is symbolic and intense, and even scenographically speaking, a bridge between the two spaces, both of which play out only in her mind. Because remember, she doesn't exit the mansion. It is only her perception that informs her decisions about her home and the political instability manifesting in revolutionary India. Through the film, we get to see how the two spaces are in constant dialogue, how the domestic informs the public, and vice versa, as she makes moves to enact what she believes is political change and the dangers of depending on the perceptions of others. Other Ray films that I saw in this duration also influenced the concepts. the Apu trilogy paralleling my own first forays outside of my native home. But it was Charulata that, compared to Gharibari, much more subtly talks of spatial enclosures for women. And the aesthetics bring to mind Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, especially considering the time that they were both created in. Ray's other female centric film, Devi, which is the title of the film and also the name of the protagonist, played by Sharmila Tagore, is worthy of mention here because the protagonist quite literally is only relieved of her revered status in the isolation of her room. I was also reading Vivian Gornick's The Odd Woman and the City, where the narrator flicks through New York as an adult, where she also grew up, but in a different neighborhood than the one she currently lives in. The book unfolds through vignette like tellings of her experiencing the vast city and its array of characters who are also characters in her life. The geography of the city becomes a map of her own life's experiences as we map points of interaction, isolation, confusion, and observation. When Pessoa writes about Lisbon in the Book of Disquiet, one gets the sense that the writer must appear as a spirit to other occupants of the city. Yet we know from his writings how vivid his thoughts, his questions, his melancholic musings are. Under a despairing facade decorated sublimely in ennui, there rests an expression of existence. No, not expression, nothing so vague. Rather, an insistence of having experienced the world in his own particular way. More than anything else, I believe the choice of black and white film was influenced by these last two books that I mentioned. Books that seemed to be about people being ghosts, flicking around the city through vivid experiences that aren't quantified on the binaries of negative and positive, but accepted for what they are. Memorable for myriad reasons, not easy to put into words. The particular wash of all color, bright despite being colorless, as Joe called it, bleached but not bleak, was meant to evoke only a sense of immersion. I remember here what Indian theatre legend Badal Sarkar wrote in his book The Third Theatre and Other Essays, that people come to the theatre with the intention to utilize their imaginations. And so you can point at a black background and say there is a mountain, and they will believe you. He was making a case for poor theatre, which of course one might understand to sit diametrically opposite decadence and grotesque theatre. In another one of the cinema cartography's art and context video essays, this one titled The Aesthetic Instinct, they say meaning has been conveyed visually in a variety of interconnected ways, from the most direct to the most symbolic and allegorical, but never a great art piece has been conceived without some regard for aesthetic quality. Even those that denominate themselves as anti aesthetic are bound to be connected to the laws of aesthetic they seek to transgress. The two essentials, form and color, are inseparable. In modern art, color came to play an increasingly mathematical and functional part. In counterpart, the old masters would have prioritized the form over pigment. Da Vinci regarded color as a mere pleasant accessory to be placed in a well-crafted form. He believed that good use of color didn't reflect the craftsmanship of the painter, but rather the quality of the pigment itself. New developments in chemistry fueled a revolution in the use of color in the French tradition, and it's impossible to reconcile the works of Hieronymus Bosch without his skilled use of both elements. So, as I was talking about the color of the film, or more accurately, its lack of color, I would like to address here that my decision was also fueled by the realization that the performance space and atmosphere, the mehfil, was to be steeped in rich, deep colors and rustic accents, which allowed me another opportunity to test out juxtaposing aesthetics. The film is shot in movement, subjecting movement, especially the non-interview parts, but even within those, the sounds of the surroundings provide a sense of their space. These were opposed by the anchoring provided by the sensory stimulations in the performance space, with taste, smell, and visuals. The music and the storytelling were points of connection, the structural bridges. Artaud is better known for his theory than for his practice, and among his writings, his best known book is The Theatre and Its Double, in which he articulates his ideas about a plague like theatre of cruelty that would break through language and touch life, the secret forces of the universe, and the transcendent impulses of the deepest self. He valued Oriental theatre primarily because it eschewed naturalism and, seen from his outsider's point of view at least, approached the intensity and frenzy of primitive ritual, though he failed to recognize the trained precision of its technique and the precise signification of its gestural vocabulary. It is this faith in the primitive, in something that precedes language and culture, something elementally human, that links Artaud to Grotowski, Bhabha, and Brooke in their various ways and explains their interculturalism. And I would be remiss if I do not admit that these ideas link Artaud and the Universalists to my own artistic practice. But where I differ most definitely from the original school of Universalists is in my emphasis on context. This is not to be confused with anti absurdism in any way. What I mean is anthropological context. You cannot read Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot as isolated from its time of creation. It is resoundingly accepted to be a reaction to the moral and idealistic nihilism of its age, as is Badal Sarkar's Ebong Indrajit. The entire absurdist movement in philosophy and then in art is a reaction and a record of its time. Its persisting relevance, in turn, says a whole lot about our times. These are the frames of reference that cannot, and in my opinion, should not be divorced from performance making and the study of it. For example, when we talk about third theatre as developed by those icons of universalism mentioned before, we fail to consider Badal Sarkar's experiments in Indian modernist theatre with the same reverence. Rick Knowles further writes in Theatre and Interculturalism, Grotowski's search was for origins and for ahistorical essences. For him, man precedes difference, as Bonnie Maranka observes in her introductory essay to interculturalism and performance. And in his essay, Performer, Grotowski states that essence interests me because nothing in it is sociological. Bhabha's downfall is like Grotowski's. He is determinedly ahistorical, removing elements of performance from the social, cultural, and theatrical or ritual contexts that produced them and where they produce their meanings. He privileges selective examples of sameness, patterns that can be understood to be shared across differences that can themselves be understood to be accidental or merely cultural rather than of the essence. Brooke's faith in his own power and capacity, I can take all I need, to constitute a space as empty, free of social and cultural predeterminants, inequities, and power relationships that are constitutive of culture and ideology. As discussed previously, artist Farrar paintings are a fantastic point of rumination about intercultural art. But what I believe truly draws me to her work is not just the cultural hybridization, but the temporal hybridization as well. And as all art has the added benefit of being a documentation of its time and cultural and countercultural values, I felt that the themes I wish to explore could very well be adapted into a form I was culturally familiar with, allowing these transcendent social experiences to be the point of common reference in an otherwise different or unfamiliar aesthetic setting, in regards to the audience. An aesthetic and narrative setting, if I may point out, that I could introduce as a juxtaposition to the familiar experiences of migration and identity. Much like Stitch dancing with the Movellera girlies in this painting, or the iconic Corona beer case in the middle of a decisively classical scene, these points in Rizvi's art are the familiar spaces she consciously or unconsciously uses to find that point of juxtaposition. A friction is thus created in the psyche, out of which rises a unique feeling which is at once a celebration of the unique moment in time we all share, and also a gentle gift of our heritage's most fascinating elements. I attempted to bring to the performance that essence, that ras. As Rustam Bharucha writes in Theatre and the World, one cannot separate the culture from the text, and Rick Knowles agrees by adding, and the performance. And as, of course, we have evidenced in the procedure's philosophy by referring to Shaheen Sabah's thoughts on the intertextuality of individual cultural identity documentation within transcendent text translation that becomes, in essence, transmission. As Joe pointed out, it was these three T's: translation, transmission, and transportation that formed the crux of the method as a formal approach to my practice's research project. As with many universalisms, the problem with this is that what is of the essence can too easily be identified with what is culturally dominant, particularly under the leadership of a powerful and charismatic Western director such as Bhabha. This model, however, disregards material inequalities, power and funding differentials, and the different ways in which performances are situated within cultures, all of which, without the proverbial level playing field, make very fragile the possibility of genuine intercultural exchange. The first people of the Americas also thought they were engaging in barter when they exchanged the lands they inhabited, but never claimed to own, for a few beads, alcohol, gunpowder, and smallpox. As such, intercultural performance had unwittingly participated in the commodification of the other, and thereby the perpetuation of the colonial project, in which the raw materials of the world, including its cultures and peoples, were and are grist for the colonial mill of Western industry and capitalist production. This is why we study the takes of native playwrights, directors, and researchers who can provide contextual applications of these ideas. Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture and Rustam Bharucha's criticisms of Peter Brook and his Mahabharat are worthy of note here. In future iterations of the project, I hope to take these questions further, spanning various age groups and gender identities, focusing on the queer use of space. In performance, I would like to analyze and critique pieces that deal with the dichotomies of identity experience. The adventures narrated in the traditional four-part structure of a dastan saw the rise and fall of men, demons, fairies, monsters, and so on. In all such cases, certain figures as central figures, protagonists, and the narrative perspective were glaringly missing: women and queer folk. This project attempted to repair not only these gaps, but also the absence of this form in our contemporary theatrical practices. Interculturalism is much studied when it comes to historical performance cultures, and while that remains relevant, it is pertinent to now ask questions of the connections amongst non Western philosophies of performance, acknowledge their contributions and their potential. I believe that employing an anthropological perspective in the study of performance is not only an option, but a responsibility. The performance of rituals from everyday life, prayers, funerals, marriages, rites of adulthood, etc., all consist of symbolic actions that resonate within the community they come from. But from studying ecology, trade, architecture, and the making of objects throughout history and between peoples of different communities, we can begin to understand values and ideas shared by humanity as a whole. And by emphasizing the study of embodied performances in these regional situations, the courtesies, the subversions, and the interactions, an egalitarian universalist approach can be formed. One that is all the more powerful because of the context out of which it arises. While I would focus on the same essentialist approaches to transcendental universal truth finding as Artaud and Bhabha, I believe the scrubbing of social and historical context is actually detrimental to the process. Again, all the bibliography and references and suggested viewings slash readings are provided below in the description box. I would now like to take the time to thank my program leader, Jo, for her encouragement and unwavering support throughout the year, my project supervisor, Nicola, for her patience and generosity and for helping me manifest these crazy grand ambitions. And of course, many, many thanks to Rory and Meg for the infallible safety net they managed to uphold so kindly for all of us. And to the women who were a part of this project. You are all brilliant and amazing and so inspiring, and thank you for sharing your stories with me. And to my peers, thank you for your real time, innovative insight and compassion throughout the program. I adore you all so much and can't wait to see and support everything you do from here on out. All the very best. Thank you and Khuda Hafiz.